Welcome you all to Carnivale. My name is Bill Marovitz, and I'm proud to say that I'm the owner of this place, but also that I've been a longtime friend of the gentleman to my left. And it's a privilege to be able to call Dennis a friend. Before we begin, I want to thank some people that helped put this together. Most notably, Deborah Ziskine, who is just fantastic. She's couldn't be here today. She's in Pittsburgh, and she's undergoing physical therapy for some neck problems, but she really worked hard to put this together. Kent College of Law, I want to thank you, IIT, and Tufts University, and the Fletcher School. I want to thank those of you who are part of that community. I really appreciate it. Dennis Ross doesn't really need an introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway. Dennis is the consummate diplomat. He really is the best of the best in the diplomatic corps over the many years of his career. And a multi-time author. Hope you'll buy his book, Statecraft 2, which follows up on Statecraft 1. He will gladly autograph the book personally to you or anybody you'd like for Hanukkah or Christmas, and he'll do that after the program. Dennis was Director of Policy and Planning in the State Department under George H.W. Bush. Yes, long before the Democrats, Dennis was very involved with the Bush administration, the first Bush administration. And then he was Special Middle East Negotiator and Coordinator under President Bill Clinton, and was involved instrumentally in everything that happened in the Clinton administration regarding Anwar Sadat, Arafat, all the peace negotiations, everything to do with that, the Oslo Accords. He was the special advisor in Persian Gulf and Southwest Asia, including Iran, to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and is now a fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, which is a pro-Israel think tank. He is, besides being the consummate diplomat, he's just one of the nicest people that I've ever met. And I think that's why people on both sides of the aisle, no matter what your politics are, love and trust Ambassador Dennis Ross. Dennis?
First, I want to say Billy and I are not related, so it's not a family.
I'm going to give you this one.
All right. We're not related, so that was just an honest, probably exaggerated, but an honest and genuine introduction. Thank you for that. You know, what I thought I would do is explain why would I write a book called Statecraft 2.0 when I had written a book on statecraft 20 years before. A few other books on the Middle East, but this one I wrote because when I wrote the first book on statecraft, we had a very different world. We had a world where the U.S. was an uber power. We had no competitors. China was not a competitor at that point. Russia was too weak to be a competitor at that point. We had a consensus. We had a debate in this country over the issue of Iraq and the war, but there wasn't a debate over whether or not there should be U.S. leadership in the world. Today, it's a multipolar world. China is a competitor that Russia never was, the Soviet Union never was. The Soviets were never an economic competitor, they were only a military competitor. So we have a competitor that's both an economic and a military competitor. Soviets are still there. We can get into what's going on today in the negotiations, and again, even from a statecraft perspective, why we're not really succeeding in that effort. We have regional constraints. Iran is a country that wants us out of the Middle East. When I first wrote this book, Iran itself was feeling weaker and exposed because Saddam Hussein was gone, didn't know if they were going to be next. So the international landscape changed dramatically. Before, we weren't constrained, and now, not only are we constrained, we're at a place where there isn't an agreement on what our role in the world should be. So why do a book about a world that's different? Because what is statecraft? Statecraft is basically how a state uses all the tools available to it. So what does that mean? That means diplomacy, it means economics, it means intelligence, it means military, it means public information and framing something dramatically undersold. It means soft power. What's the meaning of soft power? Soft power is the power of attraction. When your objectives are embraced by everybody else because you have soft power, that immediately adds to the leverage you're likely to have. Statecraft is all about how do you use leverage to achieve what you want. What does leverage mean? By the way, something Donald Trump doesn't understand is leverage, although he applies it too narrowly. Leverage is getting someone to do something they otherwise would not do. And you use leverage in terms of being able to sometimes pressure, sometimes offer rewards. It's a combination of things. It's a combination of sticks and carrots and the like. So I wrote this book because the world is different and because I said for us to be able to sustain American support, public support, for our role in the world at a time when it's being questioned, we have to be successful with our policies. We won't be successful if we don't know how to integrate and use all the tools we have at our disposal. So what goes into making for good statecraft? I teach a course on this at Georgetown, and I always start the course by saying, look, the key to good statecraft is marrying objectives and means. Obvious, right? A given, right? Why would you have a policy where you can't marry your objectives and means? You can't align your means with the objective that you're seeking. And so I asked, how often do you think it's done in most administrations? So in Iraq, did we marry objectives and means? Do we have a clue as to what we're getting into? No. How about Syria? Why don't you pick any issue in Iraq and I'll tell you? Have you succeeded? Why is it so hard to marry objectives and means? The answer is we typically don't adopt the right objectives. By the way, this could apply to domestic policy, anything else you're doing, but in foreign policy, we don't do it because there's a variety of factors that influence why we pick objectives that we do. Sometimes we adopt objectives because we have no clue what we're getting into. Iraq, by the way, the Iraq War is a good example. We have no idea what we're getting into. So we had an objective that the president believed was the right objective, but was completely disconnected from feasibility. If an objective is feasible, you can pursue it. If the stakes are really high, you will, in a sense, be prepared to do almost anything to achieve it. Our problem is, frequently we will define objectives either because we haven't thought them through, or there's political pressure to do it. To give you an example, Lyndon Johnson in Vietnam. Did Lyndon Johnson believe that this was something that is really critical to the United States? He was unsure. What motivated him? It wasn't national security interests, it was political factors. His big fear was that if he was accused of losing Vietnam, the Republicans would say the Democrats lost Vietnam the way they lost China. Barack Obama, why does he declare that Assad has lost his legitimacy and has to go? Meaning the objective is he has to go. Only he wasn't prepared to apply the means to have him go. Why did he do it? Because for 6 months, the killings in Syria were going up and up and up, increasing, and over a period of time, he becomes feeling more pressure to do something, but he doesn't really want to apply the means because he's afraid you get into Syria and be Iraq. He's at a press conference where he says, Assad has lost his legitimacy and he has to go. Now, to be fair, before he did it, we did some organization, we worked with others to basically endorse what we were saying. But but there was never a readiness to apply the means that could make this successful. So there was a gap there. So sometimes it's political pressures that lead you not to adopt the right objective. Sometimes it's not understanding the situation that leads you to adopt the wrong objective. Sometimes you start with one objective that makes sense, and because you have some success, you redefine it. George H.W. Bush, who was a very good practitioner of statecraft generally, makes a decision in 1992 to deal with what were famine conditions in Somalia. We send in 25,000 troops to deliver food, to deal with the issue of famine.
Just to briefly recap this, we frequently don't define objectives the way we should for multiple reasons. Sometimes because of political pressures, we adopt an objective that makes no sense, because we really don't have the means to do it. Sometimes we adopt an objective because we haven't thought it through at all, and we kind of drift into it. Sometimes we adopt an objective because we simply we think it's important, but we don't understand the situation. And sometimes we adopt an objective because we start with a position that makes sense, we adopt an objective that makes sense, and then it morphs into something beyond that. I was giving an example. George H.W. Bush says, we're going to stop the famine in Somalia, which is a function primarily of a civil war with warlords fighting each other. We send 25,000 troops in 1992. It solves the problem of famine. And then Bush says, look, we did that so well. So why don't we deal with the issue of the warlords? There was a guy, Siad Barre, was the major warlord in Mogadishu. And so we say, we're going to take care of him because that will arrest the problem. That sucked us into a civil war that we didn't understand. It leads to Black Hawk Down under Clinton, because Clinton inherits the policy and says, well, I'm not going to change it. So objectives need to be thought through. You need to make really good assessments. You need to understand what's feasible and what isn't. If your stakes are really high, you should be prepared to commit dramatically more means. And if you understand this, then you start in what seems to be the right way to proceed. Now, I want to give you an example of how really smart people don't get it right. So we're in the Situation Room. This is during basically the uprising in Libya, and the president isn't chairing the meeting. National Security Advisor is chairing the meeting. He's going around the room, and the intelligence people say that Gaddafi has just slaughtered people in the town of Misrata, and there's nothing between Misrata and Benghazi to stop him. And having slaughtered the people in Misrata, now he's going to go to Benghazi and he'll slaughter. This is a much larger city. He's going to slaughter the people there. And the National Security Advisor is going around the room, and Bob Gates is the Secretary of Defense and says, we don't have a vital national security interest to intervene in Libya. It might be sad, there's going to be a lot of people who are killed, but that's just too bad. And then there's others who begin to reinforce the same point. And so I raise my hand, I say, this is all fine and good, except the president is out there publicly saying, we won't permit a massacre in Benghazi. So he is articulating an objective, and everybody here is saying, we shouldn't apply any means. So either you have to persuade him to change the objective, or you have to provide more means. And we're talking about, these are all senior cabinet people. Hillary was there, Bob Gates is there, Leon Panetta is there. So they're all looking at me like, well, who just flew in from Mars? And, there's this pause. And it's like, well, what are you suggesting? And I said, well, I'm actually suggesting something pretty straightforward. If we're going to have an objective, we ought to have the means to be able to achieve it. If we don't like that objective, if we think that's the wrong objective, then you're gonna have to get the president to redefine what he's saying. I know this will come as a shock. Nobody in the room wanted to go up to the say, gee, I'm gonna volunteer, I'm gonna go up to the president and say, Mr. President, you got this one wrong, you gotta redefine it. Now, I'm not saying they wouldn't do it in a setting, in a situation room like we were, but this was a group of really smart, dedicated, thoughtful people, and nobody thought to say, if we're gonna have an objective, or we're gonna do what the president says, what are we gonna have to do to achieve that? If we're gonna have to use force, what kind of force do we have to use? Do we wanna build a coalition? Okay, on what basis are we building the coalition? So the essence of statecraft is how you define objectives, how you marry those objectives, how you define what's important and what isn't, and then you think about the tools that you will use. What I said a little earlier about leverage. Leverage is a key point here. Oftentimes, we may not be the ones who have the main leverage in a case. I want to give you a current example. So Israel in the 12-day war, with the bombing by President Trump, which was a good thing, by the way. We can get into why it was a good thing. The Iranian nuclear infrastructure was largely destroyed. I said largely destroyed. Did I say obliterated? No, I didn't say obliterated. I said largely destroyed. It can be rebuilt. Will the Iranians rush to rebuild it? They will not, because they have no idea what Israel knows. Israel decapitated the Iranian military and Revolutionary Guard. They killed the 12 leading nuclear scientists in Iran. My best guess is there's nobody who's a nuclear scientist today who's saying to the Supreme Leader, I volunteer. Okay, so the leadership, the military leadership was decapitated. The nuclear science, the guys who developed the program, decapitated. I was actually in Israel at the time. We were all awakened at 3 in the morning when the Israelis launched their initial attack. The reason was the expectation was they would get 500 ballistic missiles in response. It took 18 hours before there was any response. It was 60 missiles that were fired because the Iranians were decapitated and didn't know what they could trust. Were these Israeli orders they were getting? They literally didn't know. Today, the Supreme Leader basically doesn't appear in public, even today. 25,000 people have been arrested in Iran because the Iranians are chasing ghosts. They assume Israelis are everywhere. They don't know what the Israelis know. So they're not going to rush to do this. But what are they doing? They have no air defense. They're trying to rebuild the air defense. What they are doing is they are rebuilding their ballistic missile force. And the ballistic missile force, if it becomes large enough, in many ways becomes the equivalent of a weapons of mass destruction when facing Israel. To give you, again, an example of this, we have an apartment in Ramat Aviv. Towards the end of the war, there was a ballistic missile carrying a 1.5 ton warhead that struck 2/3 of a mile from our apartment. It knocked the sliding glass window off its track, which shattered. We're 2/3 of a mile away. Now, if you're at ground zero, guess what happened to the building that got hit? Completely destroyed. There was much more destruction in Israel than generally is thought of. Not of the military capabilities. I'll repeat that, not of the military capabilities. But the Iranians are rebuilding their ballistic missile force. Who do you think is providing the means to help them build a ballistic missile force? Any ideas?
China.
China. Do you think China actually wants to see a resumption of this war? No, they don't. What the Trump administration was doing, if you're thinking in terms of leverage, if you're thinking you don't want to see a resumption of the war, which should be an objective, if you're thinking about how you prevent that, what are the means you have? Well, we can warn the Iranians. That doesn't mean a whole hell of a lot. But we can go to the Chinese. We can get the Saudis who don't want a war, and the Emirates who have relations with the Chinese, and those relations matter to China. We can get them to go to them and say, you do that, that is something we view as against our interests. They want to preserve those relations. To give you an example of how this works, in the year 2009, in the first year of the Obama administration, the President sent me to China to talk to them about Iran. And I said, we don't have competing interests in the Middle East right now. We share a profound interest. We don't want to see a war. There will be a war if Iran is building a nuclear weapons capability. If you join us, we can actually get the Israelis to decide that we've changed the policy enough and we're putting pressure on Iran in a way that will prevent them from going towards a nuclear weapon. The Israelis believed at the time, with the right kind of sanctions on Iran, Iran would stop. So I said to the Chinese, if you think that we can't persuade the Israelis if you and us together impose real sanctions on the Iranians, you have it wrong. The Israelis believe with the right kind of pressure, economic pressure, Iran will stop. Maybe they're not right, but that's what they believe. So if we can adopt heavy-duty sanctions on Iran, that will avoid a war. But if you don't join us, and we can't succeed in that, then the prospect of there being a war goes up. You don't want that, we don't want that. We ended up adopting UN Security Council Resolution 1929, which imposed unprecedented sanctions on the Iranians, and the Chinese joined us. So those, sometimes you think of, well, your allies are your natural partners. They're your means to affect the behavior of someone else. It turns out oftentimes it's not your allies. It may even be your adversaries, but there's no reason in certain cases where their interests aren't the same or converge with yours. So if we want to prevent a resumption of the war between Israel and Iran, we should be focusing right now on the Chinese and getting them to stop providing the help to rebuild the ballistic missile. Because I'm telling you, today there's no understanding between the Trump administration and Israel on what would be a trigger. For the Israelis, the ballistic missiles are a trigger. And it shouldn't be misunderstood. The Israelis should be working with the Trump administration to say, look, if we see this ballistic missile development pass a threshold, we're going to act militarily. And that should motivate us to do some things. Right? That's an example of you identify an objective, you think about the means, you think of what your forces of leverage are, and so forth. I want to say something about Trump, and as a former negotiator mediator, I have an enormous capacity to speak for very long periods of time. Not take a breath and never repeat myself. And I can do that easily, but I'm not going to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a couple of examples from the book. Susan, I know you want me to do readings, and I do dramatic readings really well, but I'm going to refrain from that. So I want to give you a couple of examples of, again, how this works. So, bless you. Full service. Look, I have a 50-page chapter in Iran in the book. The one thing that Trump did when Trump carried out attacking the 3 nuclear infrastructure sites in Iran, there are about 40. We hit 3 that are the most significant, one of which the Israelis could not take out on their own. Fordo, every time you hear the term bunker buster, that's a misnomer. Fordo is a mountain, and they built in the base of a mountain an enrichment site. And by the way, they stockpiled there about 400 pounds of highly enriched uranium to 60%, which is extremely close to weapons grade. This was in Fordo. You needed a mountain buster to take it out. The mountain buster was actually a capability developed during the Obama administration, known as the massive ordnance penetrator. So he hits Fordo, he hits Isfahan, which is a conversion site, and he hits Natanz, which is the major site of enrichment. What he does is what no Republican or Democratic administration or president had done. Iran has convinced different administrations that they would set the region on fire if we ever attacked them directly. They use their proxies. They don't care if their proxies get killed because they're always willing to fight to the last of their proxies. But they're very sensitive and not wanting to be hit directly. So they convinced us in a way that created deterrence, because they convinced we'll set the whole region on fire if you attack us. So what I did in the Iran chapter is I showed that's not who they are. In the Reagan administration, which I was also in, as you said, I was a political appointee for Reagan and Bush and a political appointee for Clinton and Obama, which makes me an extinct species. So the Reagan did something known as reflagging of Iraqi ships, actually all ships going into the Gulf. Why? Because Iran was trying to cut off Iraq's ability to finance the war by stopping all shipping that was going to Iraq, to the port of Basra, to permit Iraq to continue to have revenue, and also to ensure that the overall traffic, oil transshipment and so forth, the tankers, were able to continue to function. We reflagged all the ships going into the Gulf and headed towards Basra. So if you attacked the ship, you were attacking an American ship. We ended up sinking about half of the Iranian Navy. We destroyed a number of their oil platforms, and we inadvertently, which the Iranians did not believe was inadvertent, we inadvertently shot down a civilian airliner. In the aftermath of that, Khomeini, the first Ayatollah, he declared he would end the war, something he said they would fight forever. Khomeini, the current supreme leader, was the president of Iran at the time. The conclusion he drew from that is, you sure as hell don't fight America. What is the number one preoccupation of the Iranian regime? Survival. What's the one thing that they viewed as threatening survival? Getting into a direct war with us. That's why you use proxies. So the bluster was exactly that. It was never going to be real. Look at what's happened twice with Trump. I'm not sure he's learned the lessons. I'm not sure he did it for the right reasons. But what's happened twice with Trump? We killed Qasem Soleimani, who was the head of the Quds Force, who was the architect of the development of the proxies throughout the region. Yeah. And he was like a rock star, an Iranian rock star. He was extremely close to the supreme leader. There were a lot of people at the time who said, oh, the sky's going to fall in the region. What did they do? They hit the al-Assad base where we had a presence in Iraq after they communicated through the Iraqis to let us know they were going to do that. You don't do that unless you're trying to contain everything and ensure we're doing a one-off. We're telling you we're doing a one-off. We don't want this to escalate. What did they do this time? They hit the Al-Udeid base, which we have 10,000 people in Qatar, and what did they do? They did the same thing. They came and told us in advance, we're going to hit the base. Take all your precautions. Get your missile defense ready. It did no damage because we intercepted everything they sent. And then Trump says, we're over. Same thing after Soleimani. Okay, they did that. Okay, we're over. What the Iranians did is they made a symbolic move because they don't want to get into a direct war with us. We have given them impunity for no reason. And it was a mistake. By the way, by giving them that impunity, everybody in the region saw they had impunity. So I sort of spell out, who they were, how they evolved, why this is fundamental, and I lay out how should you deal with the Iranians. By the way, it doesn't mean you don't negotiate, but it means you understand what their calculus is and how you can affect it. You understand who can be your partners in that negotiation, both in terms of putting on pressure and in terms of giving them an explanation at the end. Okay, so that's Iran. What about the Israelis and the Palestinians now?
Okay, let me before we get to the Israelis and Palestinians,
Yeah.
let me ask you a question, and I want you to apply your statecraft to current situation in Ukraine and Putin,
Yep.
and what we're doing, should be doing, and how statecraft could apply there.
Okay, good question. I'll start by saying not what we're doing now, okay? What's our objective? Let's start with what our objective is. Our objective should be end the war in a way that Ukraine's sovereignty is intact, number one. Its independence is intact. And Putin will understand the high cost of even thinking about, once again, invading a neighbor. So that's the objective. The objective is to end the war, but in a way where Ukraine has its independence and its sovereignty, and Putin understands there's a high cost, an unacceptable cost to him, and the rest of the world. It's not just that. You're ending this war in a way that also has lessons for China as it relates to Taiwan. This is a world that is interconnected in multiple ways. So your objective needs to be, we have to end this in a way that makes everybody more safe, makes territorial inviolability more real. All right, so what needs to be done? That's the objective. So what are the means? Last month, by the way, Putin seems to be impervious to the cost. That's what everybody thinks. If he was so impervious to the cost, he wouldn't be talking the way he is, that we're going to win, we're going to take everything over. Why is he saying this now? He wants to create an aura of inevitability that if you stop the war now, you'll stop some of the suffering. But if you don't stop the war now, we'll achieve what we want anyway. Well, they lost 25,000 dead this month to gain about 2 kilometers. Ukraine for Russia is the equivalent of World War I in trench warfare. Now, he's gotten away with it so far, at least in terms of domestic opinion in Russia. He can't keep losing this. He's been operating on the basis that time is on his side. And actually, he became more convinced time was on his side after Trump was elected. Just one digression here. During Biden's time, there wasn't one overflight of NATO by Russia. There wasn't one drone operating in a NATO country. There wasn't one even accident where Poland is providing all this material directly to Ukraine. There were threats. He never did a thing to cross the line into a NATO country. What's it doing now? Drones are overflying all the time. What's that tell you? Not afraid. Before he understood there was a risk. Now he doesn't see a risk. So the objective, as I said, is end the war, but end it in a way where Ukraine is intact and the Russians understand, this is folly, and others understand that, boy, Putin made a big bet and he lost. Now, to be fair, if you raise the cost too high to Putin, he may decide it costs me less to continue the war than it does to end the war. So you also have to come up with an approach that basically says, all right, we are going to raise the cost to you, but we will also give you a way out. We will give you a ladder to climb down. So how do you raise the cost to him? Trump talked about providing Tomahawks, which have a long distance capability, which, by the way, could hit Russians where they stage forces. We should go to Putin now, not the way we did with 28 points that were essentially written by the Russians. We should go to Putin now and say, look, we will work to end the war. And here are the kind of terms which will also give you some explanation. Look, you don't get to control territory that you don't control. But, we will decide that your frozen assets, $300 billion, will be returned to you. We will agree that Ukraine can't be a member of NATO. We will give you that. We will recognize in a de facto way, which we haven't legally, Crimea and the parts of Ukraine, about 20% of Ukraine that you currently control. The ground defines the outcome here. Doesn't mean we will make it a de jure recognition, but we'll accept it as fact. So he gains something. But he also understands there will be guarantees, security guarantees to Ukraine. And they will involve what the British call a coalition of the willing on the ground, which will be countries that are members of NATO. And there will have to be areas where the Russians withdraw those forces. So he has to understand the following will happen. If he agrees to those terms, we will not provide Tomahawks. If he agrees to those terms, we will allow the $300 billion to be returned to Russia. If he doesn't agree to those terms, we will now say the $300 billion in frozen assets should be given to Ukraine for reconstruction purposes. And we will impose more sanctions. Give him a choice where he has a lot to lose, but he also has something that he can rationalize and say, okay, here's what we gained. Our position right now is a guarantee this war doesn't end. Because we had 28 points. If I went through the 28 points with you, one of the things they would highlight is basically Russia gained everything. Russia made almost no concessions at all. I mean, can you imagine Ukraine has to reduce its forces by 25 to 30%. Are there any limitations put on the Russians? Zero. He gets territory he doesn't control today. There is a commitment to holding a Ukrainian election within 100 days. He's all along saying, you know, this is a coup that took place in Ukraine. I mean, this is something he should be able to affect what's done domestically. The Russian language has to be protected. It has to be taught in Ukrainian schools. This is literally something written by the Russians. So after Rubio met with the Ukrainians and the Europeans, many of these terms, not all, were softened. So that it becomes more tolerable for the Ukrainians, and the security guarantees will have to be real.
When I was in the Bush administration in 1992, I didn't really have Middle East responsibilities. So I was sent to Ukraine after Ukraine declared independence. And my purpose in going there was first to talk through the kind of civil-military relations they needed to have if they were going to be a democratic state. But then also to talk to them about their nuclear weapons. In the Soviet Union, there were 4 republics that had nuclear weapons. One was Ukraine, one was Belarus, one was Kazakhstan, and the other was the Russian Republic. We didn't want there to be 3 additional nuclear weapon states. So we wanted the nuclear weapons in Ukraine and Kazakhstan and Belarus to be returned to Russia. I was meeting with the Ukrainian President Kravchuk, 1992, and he says to me, you need to understand something. If we give up these nuclear weapons, the first thing the Russians will go after will be Ukraine. Will be Crimea, and the next thing they will go after is Donbass. This is 1992, this is Yeltsin as president, this is what the Ukrainians saw. I came back, we didn't do the deal in the Bush administration. I was in Clinton, but I was a Middle East negotiator, not this one. The Clinton administration did the Budapest Memorandum. The Budapest Memorandum had the Ukrainians giving up their nuclear weapons, turning them over to the Russians, in return for security guarantees of territorial inviolability from us, the UK, and the Russians. So they did this once. Those security guarantees turned out to be paper guarantees. They amounted to nothing. So if you're going to talk about security guarantees for the Ukrainians, they have to be real. By the way, it doesn't seem to be something that has been understood by the Trump administration. Every commitment that Putin has made on Ukraine, he has violated. Every single one. There was a Minsk agreement. There was Minsk 1 and Minsk 2, broken primarily by the Europeans and the Germans. He broke every one of those agreements. So the idea that he will agree to something and we won't have to do anything about it, or he will agree to, one of the things that was agreed in 28 points is there would be a kind of demilitarized area that the Russians wouldn't go ahead and occupy. You know, I would be willing to place a book right now on how long it would be before he would start with little green men the way they did in Ukraine to begin with. So the answer to Ukraine, using a statecraft approach, is define the objective clearly, raise the cost to Putin in a way that he will understand. If he sees us providing, I said, tomahawks and providing direct military support to Ukraine, which the Trump administration stopped. We provide no assistance to Ukraine. We are providing intelligence. We provide no assistance to Ukraine. Weapons now can only, we will sell them to Ukraine or sell them to the Europeans. We provide no weapons and no further material assistance to the Ukrainians. That convinces Putin that time is on his side.
Okay, so why do you think, why does the diplomatic community think that Putin is being so weak in dealing, Trump is being so weak in dealing with Putin, not standing up to him like was done before, okay? And he's allowing Putin to rule the roost when it comes to ending the war, a resolution, the settlement, the peace negotiations, all of that.
Nuclear war.
Well, I mean, look, Trump has been concerned that this will trigger a nuclear war. At least that's what he said. But I think we also have to recognize he has been a fan of Putin's for a long time. When in the first term, he has a meeting with Putin and he accepts Putin's explanation. They didn't intervene in the 2016 election, contradicting his own intelligence community. When he met with Putin, by the way, he didn't bring in an American translator. There was nobody in there with him. It was just Putin and Putin's translator. So everybody, look, you can speculate on what the reason is. If you're charitable, you say he has a fear that this could escalate into a nuclear war. Okay, if you're charitable, maybe that's true. If you're not charitable, you have different interpretations of why he gives in to Putin. But he said, look, it's interesting. He said at one point that he was asked the question by a journalist, "Is Putin playing you?" And his answer was, "A lot of people thought they could play me. I've come out pretty well." Well, all I know is I look at the 28 points, and if you were a mediator, this was not a mediation, this was a surrender document.
Okay, let me move on to things that are going on right now, and that is the Gaza settlement, and under the Gaza peace plan, there is the International Stabilization Force.
Yes.
To provide stability and policing. There is the Board of Peace, which Trump thinks he'll be the head of, which is a transitional administration, supervising the transitional administration. There's the disarmament of Hamas, and there's the massive reconstruction project. So there's the interim Palestinian administration to take over from Hamas. With all those things yet to happen,
Correct.
okay? And none of them really moving toward happening. How do you see this coming up? How do you see this ending?
Well, first, let's give Trump credit for getting the ceasefire and getting the hostage, the live hostage released. He deserves credit for it. I can tell you that the intelligence community in Israel was convinced that maybe you could get most of the hostages back, but you would never get all of them back. There are 2 bodies still that haven't been returned, but when I said get the hostages back, that was also referring to the live hostages. So he got them. And he used leverage effectively with Turkey, with Egypt, with Qatar. Whether he understood it or not, all of them wanted to be in a position where they could prove to him that he had an interest in good relations with them. And so they delivered. They put real pressure on Hamas, especially the external Hamas leadership. They did that while the Israeli military was putting real pressure on the ground on the military wing of Hamas in Gaza. So that at the end, it was actually, ironically, it was the internal Hamas that wanted to do a deal. And it was the external Hamas, the political leadership, that did not want to do the deal, but they got pressured. by the two who really can put pressure on them, which is really Qatar and Turkey. So he succeeded in that. Now the 20-point plan, they like double-digit plans. The 20-point plan is a plan on which there isn't one point that is understood the same way by any of the actors. Now that's okay to get the initial ceasefire and get the hostage out. Really, that's okay. But once you've done that, then you have to work out what does each point mean. And if you can't negotiate that, you basically say, this is what we understand it means and this is what has to happen. What I do not understand, the minute this was done, and I will tell you, the concept of the border peace, the concept of the transitional Palestinian administration, and the concept of an international stabilization force were all developed during the Biden administration. I wasn't part of the Biden administration, but I was informally kind of drafted in to help, and I was talking with the UAE and others who were involved in this. All of those were there. So if this, none of this is a new concept. The 20 points were, to be fair, the 20 points are new. But of course they were built on this construct of a border peace that will be internationally and regionally led, that provides the authority for this interim administration of apolitical Palestinians, meaning not from any faction, and an international stabilization force, because you know you cannot leave a vacuum. Okay? So why wasn't the border peace announced the same day that you announced the acceptance of the plan? When Trump said, by the way, this is not an exaggeration, when he said everybody's asking him to be the CEO of the border peace, that was true. You know why? Because they all didn't want him to walk away, right? So this gives a continuing interest. But why didn't you announce the whole board? Why didn't you announce this apolitical Palestinian committee? You knew for a long time this was necessary. If you're going to create an alternative to Hamas, everybody has to see there's an existing alternative to Hamas. That wasn't done. Now the International Stabilization Force is more complicated, because you have to agree on the mandate of that force. And the 20 points talk about the disarmament of Hamas, which there needs to be a disarmament of Hamas. By the way, the Saudis want disarmament of Hamas. They've made it clear there is no reconstruction funds coming from them for Gaza if Hamas is not disarmed. For the obvious reason, they will be the only ones. Who's going to invest in reconstructing Gaza if Hamas still has its arms and will do this again? It's not an argument, it's a fact. So you had to be ready to deploy this quickly. By not doing it, Hamas has been reconstituting itself in Gaza, which makes the achievement of all the points that much more difficult. Is it impossible? No. You can still use pressure and leverage. Hamas is weaker than it was, but the more time you let go by, the harder it becomes. There is a fallback plan now. The fallback plan is to build up to 53% of Gaza that Israel controls. Now I want to explain this to you. Israel controls 53% of Gaza. Anyone want to guess what percent of the Palestinians who live in Gaza are in the 53%? Just take a guess.
15%.
No, there's something. 10%. So 90% of Gazans are in the part of Gaza that is controlled by Hamas. So the idea, you will build up the part of Gaza where Hamas is not, and that will attract people to come in. It's a good theory. It's a legitimate theory, but just like what I was saying before, if that's going to be your objectives, then you have to ask a lot of questions about how you'll be able to do this. If you're going to let a few people in at a time, it doesn't really become a magnet. Because basically, you have 1.8 million people living in the areas that Hamas controls. If you're letting in a couple hundred at a time, that's not very persuasive. But if you're letting in much larger numbers, what are the odds that Hamas infiltrates with those who come in? here I would take book. So what's the answer to that? You have to, you can build up this alternative, but then you have to have a set of answers for the questions that are inevitable. How quickly can you build it up? By the way, it's supposed to be not just safe areas, it's supposed to be, you bring in portable housing, you bring in caravans, you allow commercial activity to resume, you provide basically you build temporary hospitals. I mean, you create a way to live there. But if, as I said, if the numbers are small, that's not really going to be a huge attraction. So you're going to have to sort that out. The alternative is what Egypt's trying to do. Egypt is trying to negotiate a deal with Hamas where there will be symbolic disarmament. And Hamas will acquiesce in symbolic disarmament.
What does that mean, symbolic?
It means they go through a process where they turn over some heavy weapons. Missiles they have, maybe some mortars they have, anti-tank missiles. The first issue you have to deal with is, what's the definition of disarmament? There is no agreed definition of that. You need to come to an agreed definition on it. Once you come to an agreed definition, then you have to focus on the issue of, okay, how much do they have left? Because they'll turn over a small amount and say, that's it. The odds of that being true are slim fat and none.
But you know that Netanyahu and the Israelis are not gonna agree to that. I mean, disarmament to them means one thing. To Hamas and maybe some of the Arab countries, it means something else. They're not going to agree to leave Hamas there with their definition of
right. So Billy, so let me ask you a question. So Trump wants this to be a big success. He wants to claim it's working. He wants to say there's peace. First time in 3,000 years. That number is news to me, but it's okay. So he wants to claim peace. Okay? And I'll be the first to nominate him for the Nobel Peace Prize if this works. Because he'll deserve it. But to make it work, you're going to have to work this through with a credible team of people who know how to work through the details. I want to ask you a question. So Trump wants this to be a big success. So the Egyptians, the Turks, and the Qataris come to him and they say, we have Hamas now prepared to accept a process of disarmament. You don't have to worry about the details, it's going to be a good process. Okay? So if Trump says we now have an agreement on Hamas to disarm, and that means I require Israel therefore to withdraw, not completely, because the 20 points, the understanding is, Israel withdrew, by the way, from an initial position. It was controlling about 80% of Gaza, it withdrew 53%. The next withdrawal is to take it to the perimeter, within Gaza, but to the perimeter. And Trump says, okay, you don't have to do that. Can Bibi say no?
Bibi can say no if he and his coalition believe it's a symbolic disarmament.
If Trump says, it satisfies me, and he says, Bibi, you will accept this, Bibi will not say no. All right? Now that doesn't mean we're out of the woods. That doesn't mean we're going to achieve this. That's what the Egyptians are trying to do. I don't know where Trump is right now on that. But I can give you an indicator of where he is on Syria. So Israel went in last week, and Israel went into a village called Beit Jin. They saw a contingent of Islamic Jihad embedding themselves there. This is in southern Syria. Israel went in, grabbed these guys. They then found themselves in a firefight, being shot at from people on rooftops. They killed 13 Syrians. There were 6 Israelis who were wounded. And what did Trump do yesterday on Truth Social? He said, the President Ahmed Bashar is being very effective. He's doing everything that's necessary. Israel needs to engage in serious negotiations with Syria. Israel needs to do that. Okay? By the way, he punctuated by sending a picture, by sending a short message to Shah that our ambassador brought in to see him, written largely by hand by Trump. Ahmed Shah is a great leader, and we're going to do great things together. And his Truth Socialist message, he said, we'll make peace here, and it'll be part of the bigger peace. What did Bibi do after that? Bibi came out and said, yes, we're ready to negotiate with the Syrians. Of course, we have our conditions, but we're ready to negotiate. After Israel tried to kill the political leadership in Doha, what happened then? Okay, it failed. Next thing you knew, Trump was imposing an outcome. And what did Bibi have to do in the Oval Office? He had to apologize to the Qatari Prime Minister. So Trump has real leverage on Bibi. And the question is, we've seen him use it now. I didn't even, you want the best example of leverage? These were pretty good ones I just gave you. The 12-day war with the Iranians. The Iranians, after the time for the ceasefire was to go into effect, the Iranians fired a missile. They claimed that this was fired without authorization. It was a single missile. It was intercepted by the Israelis. Bibi authorized 52 aircraft to go attack Iran. They were going to carry out a massive bombing to hit targets they hadn't hit yet. Trump gets on the phone with Bibi. These planes, they're airborne. By the way, I was told they were less than a minute away from Iranian airspace. Maybe that's apocryphal, maybe it's an exaggeration, but they're all in the air. Trump said, you'll turn those planes around. Those planes turned around. So, Trump, if he decides to exercise leverage with Bibi, he has it. That's clear. And the question is, for me, will he use the leverage for something that's real? Well, I'm raising it. I'm uneasy about what the Egyptians are negotiating. Because I think what Hamas is prepared to accept is what I say is the traditional Hezbollah relationship with Lebanon, where Hezbollah is not part of the government, but in fact has a veto over everything. So I think that can be prevented. And I'll tell you, since I'm on a roll, I'll tell you how to do it. The mistake with the International Stabilization Force has been the discussion of the mandate. The mandate is, okay, you have to go disarm Hamas. And nobody wants to go in to physically disarm Hamas. So nobody is signing up to the International Stabilization Force if that's the mandate. I suggest we do the following. We change the mandate and say the mandate is preserve law and order and protect the civilians and the public. Why is that important? Hamas defines itself as an organic part of the Palestinian people. The level of anger towards Hamas in Gaza today is overwhelming for obvious reasons. Look what you did to us. But Hamas, as long as they have the ability to intimidate the public, you aren't going to get them expressing that. You bring in a national stabilization force whose purpose is not to go to attack Hamas, but to protect the public. First, those forces can rationalize that. Secondly, it tells the public we don't have to be afraid. Thirdly, it sends a message to Hamas. If you're going to take them on under those circumstances, you will be isolated internationally, and the public opposition to you is going to become more acute. Under those circumstances, they'll say, okay, look, we'll go along with the process, and then rationalize it. We'll live to fight another day. What they're trying to do with the Egyptians is, in a sense, get an outcome that's agreed, legitimized, where they really don't have to give up all their weapons. Here's a case where you create a context where they understand they'll actually have to give up somehow most of them. Change that, you'll produce the International Stabilization Force. Look, you can assume that when I try out ideas here and say them to you, you can assume I've conveyed them before. Oftentimes, my ideas are greeted with restrained enthusiasm. So far, this one has not been embraced, although I've conveyed it.
Let me ask this question. You brought up most of these important elements were in place under the Biden administration. I was going to ask you a very specific question, but I'm going to turn to the head of the Jewish United Fund, Lonnie Nassar, to ask the question, because we were going to ask a similar question And I think Lonnie will phrase it in a better way. Lonnie, do it so that everybody can hear.
Sure, I'm trying to raise.
Why don't you stand up so everybody
Okay,
can-
sure.
This is Lonnie Nass with the head of
How you
GAO.
doing? So Dennis, my question to you is, as somebody that obviously grew up in the State Department, Washington Institute, you've been fully steeped in both history and you've written amazing books that I've read for many years and all the rest, and your own colleagues obviously have been steeped in history and understanding of how to use leverage, means and objectives, and everything you said today made sense. But something that seemed to be, I think, readily apparent to many of us was, so what made the success of what we saw with respect to the latest deal with Gaza and getting 20 live hostages home? As you said, the Israeli intelligence, and I've been in Israel many times since the 7th, they said, we ain't getting them back. Is there anything that we should learn or attribute to the fact that a different type of acumen / skill sets, meaning Witkoff and maybe Jared, actually got this through in ways that maybe other people couldn't have? And I just wanted to get a sense from you in terms of, does that play in terms of different style, pragmatics, transactional, whatever it may be? Is there something we can learn from the way they were able to do the impossible in the last 3 months?
Yeah, there's something very important, and that's the importance of leverage. Look, I said, part of Democratic and Republican administrations. I worked for 3 presidents very closely. 2 of the 3 were Democrats. And one of the problems on the Democratic side is a reluctance to apply leverage. There's a reluctance to apply coercion. I will tell you, one of the lessons that emerges from the book, there is no such thing as effective diplomacy without coercive diplomacy. It doesn't mean it's only pressure and military pressure, but it means you make it clear there's a price that whoever you're dealing with doesn't want to pay. And you are prepared to impose that. Just as I was saying on Ukraine, you can make Putin understand time is not on his side. And that gives him a reason to think, okay, maybe I need to find a way out. And then you give him a ladder. What Trump did that worked is, everybody decided it was time to end this war. Okay? What he did is, after Doha, basically tell Bibi, that's it. Gave you plenty of time, that's it. But Turkey and Qatar wanted the war end too. And they had leverage on Hamas. And what Israel, to be fair, what Israel was doing, what the IDF was doing, was squeezing the noose tighter and tighter around Hamas within Gaza. So that at least the Hamas elements in Gaza wanted the war to end. So you had a moment, I say by the way in here, timing is to statecraft, what location is to real estate. When you have a moment, you have to seize it, but you have to be prepared to apply real pressure. And it's not pressure that you think should work, it's pressure that you come to understand is what matters to those you're dealing with. Trump applied real pressure. That's what made this. Look, go back to the initial, right before Trump comes in, there was a hostage release deal. The whole thing was negotiated by the Biden administration. It was, their people did it, all the details, every single word. Witkoff flies out there right before the weekend of the inauguration. He sees Bibi and he says to Bibi, President won't understand it if you don't agree to this. That's it. The Qatar was telling Hamas, look, if we agree this will become Trump's deal, he will want the war to resume. Okay? There was an expectation of pressure from Trump that produced it. Witkoff didn't negotiate a comma. All he said was that. So it was pressure. And then what got this deal, specifically this deal, was a recognition that it was time for this to end, but it was also the real pressure from and the coercion from Trump. Now, sometimes he knows how to apply pressure effectively, sometimes he doesn't. You know, for much of his approach to other countries, he thinks that tariffs are the be-all and the end-all of relationships. And it turns out, in some cases they are, in other cases they're not. But the lesson from this is coercive diplomacy.
So Dennis, let's apply that coercive diplomacy, which worked so well to at least get a peace plan in place. Let's apply the coercive diplomacy to why it's not being exercised on Putin in the Ukraine situation.
I don't have a good explanation for it. You asked the question before, what do people think is the reason that President Trump won't apply real pressure on Putin? There have been times when he seemed like he was inching towards it, and then he walked it back. I don't know. I mean, maybe you have an explanation. I don't have an explanation. I don't understand why there's a hesitancy to apply real pressure on Putin. The irony for me is, if he succeeds in this, it has a lesson for President Xi in China. You think after what the Israelis did in Iran in 12 days, with them what we did, you think that President Xi thinks, gee, this is a good time to go try to take Taiwan? The answer is no. But if he looks like he's going to concede to Putin on this, what's the message to Xi? So we're dealing in an interconnected world in many respects. That's what a multipolar world almost by definition means. And so I don't know what it is. This book was written before. I finished the book before the election. So Oxford University Press allowed me to make a few additions after the election. And one of the points that's made in here is, how do you marry objectives means? How do you adopt the right objectives? When I would go and brief presidents before, I would make a case for the objective. I would offer a highly nuanced pro and con. And I wrote here, that wouldn't work with Trump. What would work with Trump is you go into Trump and say, look, with this objective, you win. With those objectives, you lose. The way Ukraine ought to be presented to him is, this is Putin's win and your loss.
All right, I'm going to open this up to questions now, because I think probably there's a lot of people who have questions. Dana Levinson in the back. A microphone's coming your way. Hopefully it'll work.
Thank you. Ambassador Ross, could you handicap the possibility of Hamas or Hezbollah pulling off another October 7th in this environment, whether it's a year down the road, 2 years down the road?
I would say it'll take them much longer than 2 years. The key to October 7th, and the key to any strategic surprise, is basically a set of assumptions that are wrong-headed. And those assumptions create a prism through which you interpret all information. The Israelis were convinced that Hamas in Gaza had assumed responsibility and therefore had no interest in a war with Israel. I heard this directly. I was in Israel 2 months before October 7th, and I heard from everybody I saw, including I was down in Southern Command, opposite Gaza, and I heard the Hamas has no interest in a war. And they said to me, it's not that they may never have an interest, it's not they're giving up their ideology, but they have no interest in a war now. So there was a complete misreading. All the information they were picking up that was giving the telltale indicators, no, we're actually planning this, they said, just going through the motions. 1973, Israel had Nasser's son-in-law, well, Sadat's there, but Nasser's son-in-law as an agent who told them when the attack would come, and nobody believed it. You create a groupthink. Groupthink is the enemy of good statecraft. Groupthink is the enemy of making good assessments. You always need to be asking hard questions. So, the tendency now will be to move in the opposite direction, to see threats where there aren't yet. But the trauma of October 7th is also producing this sense within Israel, we need buffer zones. And that can create its own set of problems, because it can mean opportunities that are there to actually end conflicts actually don't, basically they will disappear.
I was gonna bring up and ask you one of the questions I was gonna ask you. what's the prospects and how long are the prospects for a two-state solution? But we're so far away from that. This peace plan's got to be, actually implemented. I won't even waste anybody's time, even though I think that the two-state solution is the only way there's going to be real, lasting peace.
No, I'll say something about that.
Okay.
I will. Look, what's the essence of this conflict? The essence of this conflict is you have two national movements competing for the same space. They both have their identity shaped by it. So the starting point has to be, you're not going to have satisfaction if there's a denial of the ability to express your national identity. The problem on the Palestinian side is they don't have a leadership that is prepared or capable of making decisions that they would have to make. Decisions that require them to give up what has been part of their narrative. There will not be a right of return for Palestinian refugees to Israel. There will not be. But I'll tell you something, in the year 2000, with the Clinton parameters, we came very close to an agreement. The entire Palestinian delegation that was there negotiating, after we presented the Clinton parameters on December 22nd of the year 2000, the entire delegation agreed that they should accept it. They even made a decision not to brief Arafat in advance, but to go in as a group, as there'd be strength in numbers. One person who hadn't come, told Arafat, look, they're going to come back. He didn't give the details. They're going to come back and they're going to recommend accepting it. And this person said, you can do better. Shimon Peres once said, everybody who's never at the table always thinks they can negotiate better. And Arafat, when the group walked in, Arafat said, you're all traitors. You were prepared to sacrifice the national cause. And now I had dinner with a member in Ronald is a town in the West Bank. I had dinner with one of the members of that delegation about 18 months ago. And he says to me in the most rueful way, can you imagine where we would be today if we had said yes?
Is it impossible? Right now, yes. Right now, yes. But does that mean it's impossible forever? No, but there's a lot. You have to change the psychology. You have to build from the ground up. You have to use normalization. Sounding normalization of Israel will not come before the Israeli election. I'm not saying it'll come immediately after, but for sure it will not come before the Israeli election. You use sounding normalization to get the Israelis to also take certain steps towards the Palestinians. You focus right now on coexistence. You frame the issue as coexistence. Coexistence with dignity and security for both. You'll get into how do you achieve that? As long as you have the division between Palestinians, put the issue of trauma to the side. As long as you have a division between Gaza and the West Bank, between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, there's no Palestinian state. As long as you have a Palestinian Authority that has no credibility with its own public, no legitimacy with its own public, there'll be no Palestinian state. As long as you have a Palestinian Authority where there could be independent militias, like Hamas, or the ability to form an alliance with rejectionists or Iran, there'll be no Palestinian state. There are a set of conditions or standards that have to be met. The psychology on both sides has to change. You have to show that cooperation is both possible and that there's a benefit from it. And then you husband the issue of normalization in a way that gets the Israelis to begin to make additional moves. None of this, by the way, will happen before the Israeli election.
So, in about 2007, I was in Ramallah and I met with Salam Fayyad for about 2 hours in Ramallah. He was the prime minister of the Palestinian Authority. And I was totally taken aback about how brilliant this man was, how rational this man was. And he says, I asked him about a Palestinian state. He said, we're not ready for a Palestinian state until we get our act together. economically and in every other way. And then when it comes time for a state, we'll be ready. He made so much sense, it was unbelievable, but there is no, and they basically threw him out, okay? There is no political leadership, and until there's another Salam Fayyad or whomever, it's going to be very difficult to create a second state next to Israel.
100%. By the way, if you were here and you said that to him, you know what he'd say today? We're not ready for a state. We have to build the institutions of statehood. We have to build a foundation for it. When he was saying that to you, he was he became prime minister in 2007. Why? Because President Bush, talking about coercion, President Bush said to Abu Mazen, we will cut you off unless you appoint Fayyad as your prime minister and empower him to get out of his way. And for 5 years he did. One of our mistakes in the Obama administration was after I left, and it was after Hillary was gone. It was when Kerry was the Secretary of State. One of the mistakes was when Abu Mazen went to fire him, we did nothing. We should have gone to Abu Mazen at that time and say, you fire him, here are the consequences with us. We didn't do that. By the way, apropos of leverage, in December of 2023, I was invited over to sit with the Secretary of State and as many people, and one of the things I said to him, we went over a bunch of issues, but one of the things I said was, Abu Mazen is putting out that he's going to appoint Mohammed Mustafa as his new prime minister. I said, I've known Mohammed Mustafa since 1993. He is a decent person. He is technically very competent, and he has no independence whatsoever. If this is being done to say they're reforming, it's not that Mohammed Mustafa wouldn't like to be a reformer, it's that he does not have the ability to be a reformer. Now the fact that Abu Mazen is putting this out, it's a trial balloon to see what it draws from us. We need to go and say, you will not appoint him as prime minister. Why don't you appoint Salam Fayyad again as prime minister? But there are others. Jihad al-Wazir has a profile much like what Salam's was. Salam spent 20 years in the IMF World Bank system. Where is Jihad? He's in the IMF.
Okay, questions, I know. Right here.
What do you think about Marwan Barghouti?
Marwan Barghouti?
Yeah.
So Marwan Barghouti is in jail serving 5 life terms. He was convicted of being responsible for the deaths of a number of Israelis in the Second Intifada. He is seen as more credible by Palestinians in the West Bank than probably anybody else, mostly because he's in jail. Could he come out and be this kind of a leader? I don't know. The Israelis are not inclined to release him. Hamas at one point was putting his name on the list of prisoners to be released. I can tell you there were 2 people who were against that. Bibi Netanyahu and Mahmoud Abbas. Israel didn't want to release him, and they didn't, because it was going to be too much of a political symbol. I don't know. Look, I think if there was a serious approach on this about Marwan Barghouti, yeah, you would have the Shin Bet have quiet conversations with him in jail to find out what he would be prepared and what he wouldn't be prepared to do. You know, and maybe what he would say is, I'm going to unify everybody, including Hamas. And maybe the conclusion he would draw is, you know, he will end up conceding too much to Hamas. Maybe. But if you don't have those conversations, you don't know whether or not he could be someone who could make a difference. There is not a Palestinian leadership now today that has any legitimacy. Hamas doesn't, and they shouldn't have it. And Abu Mazen doesn't. He's the only, look, Arabs would point to Abu Mazen, to be fair, because he's the president of the Palestinian Authority and there's no one else.
Question.
It's kind of a generic question from a negotiating standpoint, but I'll animate it with the Ukraine example. So you've outlined the fundamentals of your negotiating strategy. You know, what are your interests or objectives? What leverage can you bring? What are the costs that are associated with everybody? But what if you actually can't control your own, or you don't know your own interests? So in the United States example with Ukraine, we really don't know what we want, right? Our Congress kind of goes back and forth about what it wants. Our president goes back and forth about what it wants. We, in our relationship with NATO, say and signal different things that are inconsistent. And so if you were at the negotiating table, you're trying to make a deal, and you're trying to understand your own objectives and your own means, but you actually aren't 100% confident that your side is going to do what it says it's going to do or understands what it wants to do. How do you negotiate in a scenario like that?
Look, in that case,
Did everybody hear the question?
Yeah.
Yes.
Basically, the question is, how do you negotiate unless you know exactly what your side wants, what your side's prepared to do? And I think what you said is in regard to the Ukraine situation, we don't seem to be certain of our own objectives there and what we're prepared to do.
Correct, and the question isn't specifically about the Ukraine example, it's about the fundamental sort of fallibility in your negotiating position.
so I'll answer it starting the following way. When I was Clinton's negotiator, people would often ask me, does the president always know what you're doing? And I said, he always knows what I'm doing. Sometimes before I do it, sometimes after I do it. If you're in the Middle East, you have to have the authority to operate the way I did. If I were in an administration, I was asked to go to negotiate something, and I didn't know what our real position was, I wouldn't go. You don't go and do something if you're negotiating without having established what's the decision. Now that means you thrash it out. Sometimes you have to thrash it out. But you don't go before you're ready. Because you'll send mixed messages. That's the worst thing you can do in a negotiation, is to send a mixed message. So, in the case of Ukraine, somehow, I mean, look, the fact that Steve Woodcock is doing this with Jared is important because they're very close to President Trump. And you need someone who is, first of all, seen as authoritative. They also need to know what he's prepared to do. And, you know, I don't know the process of how that works. And I'm not going to try to guess what the process is of how it works. But I understand that if they want to negotiate something on Ukraine, they need to know, you know, let's say with President Trump, there's a range of different outcomes he would accept, okay? And by the way, that could be legitimate. That's not necessarily wrong. But they need to know that. They need to know, all right, look, here is, I mean, I often said this to President Obama in the first term on Iran negotiations. I would say, I want you, I will give you what I suggest should be the case, but we have to know what's the threshold below which we will not go. You know, let's define for ourselves what we absolutely have to have, and anything less than that is not worth doing the deal. And I would say, and let's, you know, whoever's negotiating, in that case, I said, I didn't want them to know it up front. Because there's a tendency with a lot of negotiators to play a little flexibility they have way too soon. So, you know, you at least need to know, though, especially Woodcock and Gerald, need to know, okay, what is the president ultimately prepared to live with? Now, the 28 points said a profound word to me, because what he was prepared to live with was basically a surrender document. And they will not have good implications for us in Europe, not in the present she either. So the fact that this has changed is a good thing. The important thing is, again, I think for the president, you know, there are a number of people on the Hill that he does have good relations with, Lindsey Graham being an example. There ought to be a sense of, okay, let's define what we really believe we have to get. And those who are his key supporters, let them understand it as well. They'll protect it.
All right, before we close, I don't want to close it if somebody's got a question, because it's a great opportunity to talk to Dennis. Ray, I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. Ambassador, what does Israel have to do?
What does Israel have to?
What was your question?
What does Israel have to do to bring about peace? Do they have any responsibility?
Yes, both sides have a responsibility.
Right, but what does Israel have to do?
Well, for one thing, right now, Israel has to stop the violence in the West Bank that's being carried out by hilltop youth, by extremist settlers. Israel is a country ruled by law. It has to act like that when it comes to this behavior. We're seeing signs right now that they're doing it. It needs to be sustained. You've had Ben-Gvir encouraging this behavior, not trying to stop it. That has to stop. Secondly, a two-state outcome is not available anytime soon. What you said is quite right. It's not available anytime soon, by the way, and not only because of Israel. But Israel cannot be acting on the ground in the West Bank that makes it impossible ever. Maybe it's 10 years, maybe it's 20 years, but you have to preserve that as an option. For the reason I said earlier, Palestine's not going anyplace, and they're not going to give up their national identity. And there's a whole cottage industry now who says, let's just have one state. The left says, let's have one state because they don't think Israel should exist. And the truth is, they're smoking dope. These two national identities are not going to coexist in one state. By the way, look at the rest of the Middle East. Wherever there is a state, and you know this, wherever there's a state where there's more than one identity, national, tribal, sectarian, that's a state that is not at peace with itself. In the best case, it's paralyzed. That should not be what we want the future to be. One state is a prescription for a forever conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. The right in Israel, the Ben-Gvir soldiers, think the Palestinians will simply accept the fact that they have a subservient status, a second-class status. They won't. And the rest of the world won't. And Israel is not an island. It cannot exist alone. So Israel's responsibilities are, A, stop actions on the ground that would make a Palestinian state impossible ever. B, impose real law and order on those who are, in fact, carrying out pogroms in the West Bank. C, if there's a reforming PA, Israel then has a responsibility to help ensure that that reforming PA is given a chance to succeed. They did not help Salam Fayyad. They should have empowered. It was in their interest for someone like Salam Fayyad to show that his way worked. That's ultimately in Israel's interest, because then you actually have a good neighbor, which is what you would have had. Why, by the way, what was the conclusion that Salam Fayyad drew about we're not ready, we have to build a state? Where did it come from? He went Ben-Gurion. He said, Ben-Gurion, after the Balfour Declaration, said, this is very nice. We really appreciate it. But this isn't going to build a state. We have to build a state so that nobody can deny it. That's what Fort Fayyad.
I want to thank you all for coming. Thanks for investing in this trust. I hope you all learned something I sure did.